Hello. I am still Nancy Klinger, the program chair for this year's seminar, and with me are Meg Cabot, who is a member of our program committee and also just recently joined our board at the seminar, which we're really glad about, and Naomi Novik, who I've long been a huge fan of her books, starting with the Temeraire books. And let me tell you, no knocks on George R.R. Martin, but her dragons are so much cooler than the Game of Thrones dragons. They're intelligent. They're, in fact, far more intelligent than the people most of the time. And the books I'm hoping we'll discuss a lot. Meg has an awful lot of books, but the ones I'm thinking that really fit our theme are her Abandoned trilogy, which is set right here in, I guess it's called Isla Huesos.
I changed the name so that nobody would be held accountable.
You would not recognize this place at all. And it's sort of a riff on the Persephone myth and involves a lot with our very own cemetery, which is right in the center of our very own island. And Naomi's last two books, Uprooted and Spinning Silver, which I wouldn't really call them riffs on fairy tales, but they are maybe...
There's fairy tale seeds scattered on the ground, and then something grew.
And one thing I noticed in all those books is that girls and women have a lot more agency than in some of the source material. And so I was wondering, is that something that was just a conscious decision on your part, or is that just because of who you are and when you're writing?
It certainly is conscious in the sense that I write women that I know, and I've generally found that those are not women that I have seen in a lot of mass media. In books you find them, and the books in which I found those women as a young woman myself were the books that were nearest and dearest to my heart. And so I do want to write those young women for my daughter. Both Uprooted and Spinning Silver were written after my daughter was born. And I do think that that's consciously going in the back of my head as I sort of mine the ground that is really nourished by the family stories that I grew up with and the things that I'm sort of reaching back to think, what do I want to pass on to her? And that sense of women having more agency, that is absolutely something that I want.
What were those family stories?
Well, my parents are both Eastern European immigrants. My mother came from Poland. My father was born in Vilnius. And they both had two very, very different family experiences. My mother is a Polish Catholic. Her family are very rooted in her community. And Uprooted is really kind of her story. It's the story of somebody whose immigrant experience was being torn up by those roots and having to leave behind everything she knew. And Spinning Silver is about my father's experience where he and his family were Lithuanian Jews and felt themselves a hostile sort of surrounded minority in the midst of a country that was itself surrounded and in a hostile position. And that's a lot of what's sort of underlying Spinning Silver.
How about you, Meg?
Well, I've been actually sitting here listening to the other speakers, and I think a lot of what they've been saying plays into why I started writing books kind of based on other books, which was kind of a sense, actually what Madeline was saying, of hearing these myths and hearing these stories and feeling that maybe some of the characters were mistreated, and often those characters are women, that their story, or maybe they got blamed for stuff. Like, for instance, I have a book that's based on the Arthurian legend. And I remember hearing Arthurian legend when I was a kid, or my mom was obsessed with Camelot.
Right, it's always Guinevere's fault.
Guinevere gets such a bum rap in that story, and I was always, why is it her fault? So I always thought I'd like to kind of rewrite that and give her a fairer shake, because, it's not her fault. She was so beautiful that everyone fell in love with her, or whatever. So that book, Avalon High, which I wrote for a kind of middle grade audience, maybe a little bit teen, although teens today, it's probably not racy enough for them, but I rewrote it, and I actually read, I researched Arthurian legend to see if it actually was based on anything that was slightly realistic, and actually ended up reading dissertations from people who went and tried to find out if there really was a sword that was in a stone, and there are people who believe that there was a place kind of like Camelot. And so, yeah, it was just kind of motivated by anger a little bit. Or maybe not anger. I don't know if you guys read that New York Times article about grudges, that they're now finding it's kind of healthy to hold a grudge because it motivates you to go out and do things, and it motivated me to write all these books. And the Persephone myth is the same thing. Like, so the reason we have winter is because of this girl that got kidnapped by this guy. I mean, the guy is the one that we should be holding responsible, but so yeah, that's how Abandon came about. I was mad about winter being blamed on Persephone.
Talking about research, and after hearing about Eric's amazing research for the Trojan War series.
Thanks.
When you're taking a story that's been told before, do you seek out source materials and previous tellings and to make it your own, or do you try to sort of put that aside while you're doing it?
I feel like it depends entirely on what it is that I'm trying to do. So in the Temeraire series, I researched the crap out of those things. You know, I was complaining, actually, I think, to Eric, about how I spent like a week once trying to find out if there were sidewalks in Edinburgh on a particular street in 1806. And I don't know. The answer was, you know, sadly, nobody recorded that information in a place where, you know, at least a week's amount of research, as opposed to a dissertation's worth of 6 years' worth of research, could find. But with Uprooted and Spinning Silver, I was really deliberately trying to capture a world that existed in my memory when I was 5 years old, and I didn't understand that magic wasn't quite real, and I didn't know that Poland and Lithuania were like a real place that you went to, because we couldn't go. I mean, my parents it was behind the Iron Curtain. My parents had left it behind, had escaped in a certain sense. And that's a very fairy tale kind of place. And that place, when I'm trying to capture something like that, I don't want to do the detailed research, because it's an inward kind of research. It's trying to pull something up from inside me. But I kind of wanted to actually, I'm sorry, I want to go back to the idea of the teenage, of voices of young women and that anger. Because, you know, one of the things that I do feel is that teenage girls are terrifying to society.
You mean that
to
society is terrified of them?
Yes.
To a certain degree.
The joys of teenage girls, the pleasure of teenage girls
Things
is
they
terrifying.
like.
Yes. Yes. And you can always see it's always being denigrated.
Yes.
And teenage girls are often their pleasures are often being pushed down, spoken against, and I think that's because, you know, speaking of anger, that so much of the world relies on the unpaid labor of women.
Yeah.
Right? And so when women indulge their own pleasures instead of thinking about the needs of others, that is a threatening, that's a dangerous thing, because we literally can't afford to compensate women for the labor that they do the way that we compensate a lot of paid labor, right? And so I think that whenever there are things that teenage girls love, that give teenage girls voice, and it gets attacked, I'm always suspicious of the attack, and I always want to push those teenage voices, those young voices up more, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I think that's great. Thank you for saying that. It's very nice. Okay. Well, I wanted to say, going back to, can you say the name of the dragon? Because I've read your books, but I never... Temeraire. Going back to the Temeraire series, just very quickly, when I can't believe you couldn't find that sidewalk, because when I read it, I had a very strong picture in my head, because it's so detailed, and yet not like bogged down in exposition. I can totally picture every scene. I just wanted to ask, though, where do you get your research for the dragons? Because those are, I can easily picture them, but, you know, you're not going on Wikipedia for that.
I am, actually. I totally have I researched, I did go on Wikipedia to look up the average weight of tyrannosaurs. The flying speed, the maximum flying speed of pterodactyls.
Oh my God. I'm so glad I asked.
Because, you know, the thing is, right, I wanted it's that, again, that difference between the realist and the fairy tale story. The realist story, I want you, the reader, to believe that the dragons are real animals, or
Well,
like
it shows,
physical
yeah.
things in the world. And it's easier for you to believe that the less I ask you to believe. And by grounding it in things that were physically possible for animals that actually existed, at least based on, the average scientific consensus or whatever, it doesn't really matter if that was actually true. It's the people think it's plausible now, and therefore that has a kind of organic quality. It has a natural quality that makes it easier for the reader to suspend their disbelief.
No, and I get that because I do have a couple made-up countries, like Genovia. I don't know if you've heard of Genovia, but that is based on Monaco. So it is based on like a real place, but...
Right.
Yeah, I always sort of thought the real fantasy of the Temeraire books is that you could have a relationship with an animal where they could actually speak back to you, because it's like I realized as I was reading those, I'm like, wow, I'm actually holding conversation with my dog in my head like all the time,
Yeah.
So
Yes, people who have dogs think Temeraire's like a dog. People who have cats think he's like a cat. And people who have neither but have children think he's like a child. and I think all three are true.
Yeah.
I may be asking you to just come up with a list of plausible entries, as Joyce Carol Oates would say, but what stories influenced you as young readers especially? Were there ones that you read over and over, or was it the fairy tales that your parents brought from Europe?
The fairy tales were earlier on. They were the very low layer of foundation stones. I think, when I think of the books that I've been thinking about, as I say, the voices of young women, Robin McKinley's books.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Especially The Hero in the Crown and The Blue Sword were really formative for me. Interestingly, I would say Ursula Gwen, The Wizard of Earthsea, even though the protagonist is a man, because I think her voice is what I was hearing through it. And obviously The Tombs of Atuan, Tara just was amazing to me. Anne McCaffrey's books
Oh my God.
were early.
Of course.
Just,
The Dragons of Pern, for
yes.
anyone who's not
Yes.
familiar with those.
Yes. If you're not, you should read those.
Yeah,
those are
those are great.
Yep. What about you?
Well, I love those too, everything that you're talking about. I also loved, I was also a big fan of movies too, so not to get off the topic of books, but I loved movies. And I actually was a problem child reader. It took me a long time to be able to figure out how to read, that when you read, you make a picture in your head. So the first book that I read that I actually understood, this is what reading was actually Isaac Asimov's The Fantastic Voyage, okay, where they shrink people down, these scientists, and they shoot them into a guy's brain so that they can destroy a tumor, which was actually a novelization of the movie Fantastic Voyage. And after, you guys, come on, it was an awesome book. And that was the first book that I actually was like, oh my God, and I get it. And the reason I got it was because I had seen the movie. And after that, I loved all things science fiction, and obviously Harriet the Spy, which is about a writer, and
And a girl having some agency.
a girl who's a spy, and she goes out there and is peeping on her neighbors, which is terrible, but she writes it all down. So yeah, a lot of Raquel Welch is in the movie, so it does have a lady scientist.
Right.
Fantastic Voyage.
I remember that movie very well. Never read the
Telling
book.
you, I'm not sure it stands the test of time, but.
Meg, I was interested in how much you incorporated Key West locations into the Abandoned trilogy, especially the cemetery. And
Which I have to say, I walked past it the other
need to
day
go
at
inside.
night. It was beautiful.
Yeah,
and
a
it's
really
right.
great
It's
place.
literally in the center of town. It's not off in the country or out hidden anywhere. And you also incorporated some of our local traditions, like our high school has a thing, really does have a
can't believe
thing
you're
called
talking about this.
Coffin Night, where they burn a coffin. I think the junior class builds
Okay,
it.
so here's what happens. I'm going to just talk about this. First of all, our cemetery, I don't know if you all know this, our cemetery used to be on the beach, which they discovered was not a good place to put it because there was a storm and it washed all the coffins up and they floated all away. So I'm not sure if this is where Coffin Night started, the tradition of it, but anyway, now they moved the cemetery into the middle of town, so that won't happen anymore. And if you've been by the cemetery, you can see that the tombs are raised, which is also so that they won't float away in the storm. And they do this in New Orleans too. There's quite a few places where they do it. But the high school has a tradition, and I've researched and I can't quite figure out the entire thing because they're very secretive about it, and I don't have kids, so I can't quite figure out. What happens is the junior class at homecoming builds a coffin, or maybe it's one of the classes builds a coffin, and they hide it. And then the seniors are supposed to try to find it, and it's somewhere on this island. And it actually does involve throwing eggs at cars too somehow. I don't know why that happens. And actually what happens is that the grocery stores around here will not sell eggs during that week to anyone who is under the age of like 50, pretty much. Because some of the parents will go out and buy eggs for the kids because they remember when they did this. I'm so sorry if I'm telling this story wrong to anyone who's been involved in this tradition. And so if you find the coffin, if you're the other class and you find the coffin, then I guess you rule for the rest of the school year. Does somebody know about this? So then if you do find it, then you get to burn the coffin on the 50-yard line because then you've burned the other class, okay? Why it's a coffin, I've never figured out. But anyway, I ended up writing a whole book about it, or actually 3 books.
And it fits well into the underworld theme.
And I explain it in a totally fictional way in these books, that they're actually about the underworld being under the Key West Cemetery.
That's
it turns out, in case any of you didn't know, that's where it is.
Naomi, how do you think the internet is changing the way stories are transmitted, changed, adapted, owned? And you started out in fan fiction, and maybe you could give us a little short description of what fan fiction is in case anybody isn't familiar with it. But I was thinking that maybe this is the modern version of the old oral tradition where, stories would be passed along and changed and adapted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like my story as a fanfic writer, it tells what it is. I was a sophomore in college, and a bunch of my friends on my dorm every Wednesday, we would pile into one of the women's rooms. They had a big double room, and we would all watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. And this was it was the first episode I saw was The Inner Light. That was a good first episode to see. And I wanted to keep talking about it afterwards, and one of the other women pointed me at the Brown University Vax VMS server. This was before there was a graphical internet, so I'm dating myself here. But I went on and I found a mailing list full of people talking about the episode, and some of them were writing stories. Their own stories, using the characters from Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I loved several of the stories. They were wonderful. They were just as good as any short story that you could, buy in a book of short stories. And the wonderful thing about it is the total absence of any barrier to entry. Which has only gotten more and more true the more and more accessible the internet has gotten. And whenever you have a community that both doesn't have a barrier to entry and is not discriminating, because anybody who's bothering to get on the internet to talk about Star Trek: The Next Generation loves Star Trek: The Next Generation so much that it doesn't need to be a great Star Trek story. It just needs to be good enough to give you a little taste. It needs to evoke for you the things that you love and are so fanatic about in the show. And the effect of that is that you get a community that values art tremendously, where you get reader response, as opposed to, as a new writer, very often you try to join a critique group. Or a writing workshop, where everyone else in the group is themselves a writer who is giving you feedback in a kind of quid pro quo way, as opposed to because they desperately want to read that thing that you've written. Where in the fanfic community, it's different. Most people in the community are either lurkers or readers. They want to read what you're writing, and they would like it to be better for them. And they will often tell you, and that is really invaluable feedback as a writer. And it does lead to this wonderful kind of community where there's no commercial aspect to it because it's copyrighted material. You can't sell your story. And it doesn't matter how good it is, which therefore removes all need to do, promotion or marketing. You don't need to worry, is my story the right length to sell? Have I hit all the plot beats? Lots of people start stories and drop them in the middle because they can't figure out how to end them.
Yeah, and then their fans get upset.
Yeah. But at the same time, that all, I think, nourishes the underlying community, and it can lead, you can't get good art without bad art.
Absolutely.
Now that you are a published author, do you have people writing fan fiction about?
Yes,
Oh
yes,
my
people write
God.
temporary fan fiction, and there's fan fiction of Uprooted and Spinning Silver
so
also
great.
too. And in fact, I wrote a book of short stories based on fan art. We had a contest where we said, send your fan art, temporary fan art, and I picked like 32 pieces and wrote drabbles and a few longer stories for all of them. And
That's so great.
yeah, it's wonderful.
And you actually got a degree in computer science, right? And worked as was it a coder or design?
I got my my undergraduate degree was English, and then by my senior year, I was basically spending all my time on the internet, running a Transformers mush. Which is
what is
sorry,
that?
a mush is it's short for multi-user shared hallucination.
Oh, sure.
It's basically a text-based online game, multiplayer game, and so that's what I minored in. It's not on my diploma, but so then I went back and got a master's in computer science. But what I wanted to do was work on computer games, and then I got to work on a computer game. It turned out to work on computer games, you have to work 100 hours a week, never see your family, so I thought, well, I really liked this, creative aspect of it. I don't really want to, write advertising software, which was the big thing in New York City at the time. And a friend said, well, you should try writing a novel. And I'd been writing fan fiction for 10 years by then.
Well, let me ask you this. Is that why none of your books have computers in them? They're all set in the pre-computer
Oh, wow,
age?
that's an interesting question. No, actually, no. I've written a ton of stories with computers in them and fanfic with computers in them. It's just the books, I don't know. I just haven't gotten around to it yet.
Yeah.
No.
All right.
All right. How do you think, what do you think the effect the internet has had on how stories are told?
I can tell you the
adapted?
effect it's had on me. I got a lot less work done because, when you're sitting there as a writer and you're trying to write, and then all of a sudden you're like, I wonder what is happening on YouTube right now with all those kitten videos people keep sending me, and then 5 hours later. I actually had to get my assistant to change my password for Facebook and all of the social media and then not give it to me, so I don't know, I can't go on anything now. It's because I was always like, oh, remember that girl from second grade? I wonder what she's doing now. And then 8 hours later, I would still be on Facebook. So that's the effect the internet's had on me, which is that I don't have it anymore. And I actually bought something. Okay, this is just a craft. Oh, this is a piece of craft, writing craft information. I bought a thing, I don't know if you know what it is. It's called an Alpha Smart. It's the Alpha Smart 3000, actually invented, I think, in 1996. It's just a word processor, and it doesn't connect to the internet at all, and that's what I write on because that's how bad. I love the internet, though. I mean, I think it's great for exactly what you're talking about, doing fan fiction, and actually when you do want to connect with other readers and other writers, that's great. But it's very hard for me. I can't believe I just admitted to you guys that I have this internet addiction.
Well, the thing is,
It's
right?
hard.
It's true, and it's not an accident. I mean, right?
Oh,
sites.
right, you guys are one of the programmers.
Yes.
You guys are the ones who made this happen
Yes.
to all of us.
No. I mean, it's actually.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second. It's extremely dangerous. It's absolutely terrible.
They do it on purpose.
It is absolutely on purpose. When you see things that make you angry on the internet, it's not an accident. It is deliberate because anger is more engaging. And the number one thing,
as we've discussed, it's also motivating. So that's
yeah,
good.
but not that,
Okay.
not quite this amount of anger. The algorithms that are driving sites like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter are deliberately designed to do one thing, which is increase the amount of time that you keep your eyes on the screen watching ads. And they are also deliberately designed as a result to destroy community as opposed to increase community. And I say that because when you can't build community 10,000 people at a time. Community is when you have a conversation with another human being that you start caring about each other, and then you remember one another, and you form a relationship. And then you form more relationships, and it's that network that creates community.
Yes.
Right. And that is what you get in fandom.
Yes.
And that's what, I've seen build. It is actively undermined by sites that don't want you to be having private conversations because they can't put ads on the private conversations nearly as much. If you are posting something in public to 5,000 people on your Twitter feed, then that is something that gets shown. They can put an ad on it, on that content that they're paying money to store on their site and deliver over the internet, and they're using that. That content is more valuable to them. And that's why, so much of what we're seeing on the internet is being driven by these decisions, which are purely for the financial benefit of the venture capitalists funding the corporations, and not because anybody nobody thinks that that's actually good for communication or community.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's
So-
why it's so important we have these live events where we're all
Exactly,
together,
in person.
having our own community. Okay.
Did you two have any questions for each other?
I think you answered most of mine. Yeah.
I
I want to
would
know
say,
about the dragon.
Well, so I want to ask you, because one of the things that I love about your work is, speaking about voice, the really sort of natural kind of there's a sort of momentum that you have, I feel like, in the voices of your female characters, that I feel like makes them feel to me like real teenagers. So how do you get that? How do you access that?
It's very conversational. A lot of it comes from my own diaries because I did keep diaries my whole life, so I just take chunks out of that and then kind of go with the flow of that. I recently did just shred my real diaries because there's a lot in there that I do not want to. I suddenly got scared that maybe I'll die. Not from any particular thing that's happening right now, but I just thought, oh my God, I was looking through them and there's all this stuff I've written about things I don't want people to know, and so I shredded them. So now I don't have that as a source anymore. So my new source
Fortunately,
is
there's the internet.
it's strictly Key West. I'm just writing about Key West now and stuff that's happening here in basically our local paper. I'm using that because there's so much great stuff. But yeah, thank you though. That's very nice. I just think I don't know where that comes from. I think it's just I write like I talk, which is unfortunate. But some people seem to like it, so it's working out. But yeah, your books I think are, as I already mentioned, amazing because you feel so sucked into the story, which I think happens with my books. You feel sucked into the story because you feel like you're talking to maybe a crazy person, I don't know. But with your books, you feel sucked into the story because you come to care so deeply for the characters, and particularly the dragons, but also the guy. I think you come to care for the people who have come to adopt these dragons, and in Uprooted as well, you care about these, especially the female main characters' horrible problems that are happening to them, often because of magic, right. Which is so great because, it's nice to take a break from the real world and have some magic time, which I think it's good. Yeah, I don't know.
Naomi, when you're writing the Temeraire books, did you look to, Horatio Hornblower or Patrick O'Brien?
You know what? Not Horatio Hornblower. It was the Aubrey Maturin series.
Yeah.
In fact, the immediate preceding thing was that I'd seen the Master and Commander movie, and I came out of it and was like, that was okay. I'll pick up the first book. And like 3 weeks later, I've seen the movie 3 more times. I've read all 21 books. I'm like, my little brain is exploding, and I started writing fan fiction because that's what I do. And the thing that happened to me, which had never happened to me before as a fanfic writer, and which still to this day is like a signal for me that, wait, stop, you're not writing fanfic anymore, is that I started to find the characters constraining. I started to get more interested in the world that I started to imagine. I wrote a whole bunch of Aubrey Maturin fan fiction, and then I started writing a story, and I realized, wait, I don't actually want to write about Jack and Stephen. I want to write a story about this world. And so I tossed the story, and I started writing a story about dragons in the Napoleonic Wars. And very quickly it became, but it was absolutely, I sort of say that it's a family tree, and Anne McCaffrey's on one side and Patrick O'Brien's on the other. And
That's
they
such a
meet
great
in
way
the
to put
middle.
it, yeah.
And I like the fact that, once again, women have some agency. There are dragons that will only accept a woman captain, right?
Yeah, well, I wanted there to be women in the aerial corps. I had to make an excuse for it, so, but I had the power to do that, so.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we've got time for some questions from the audience. If we...
Yeah.
Okay. I can't wait. Hopefully not anyone who did Coffin Night. Has something to say about that.
No, I hope so. I didn't even hear us from Coffin. I want more details.
Yeah, recently, a bunch of things came into the copyright went off a number of works because
Right, public
the
domain
Congress
day,
had
yes.
increased the copyright, the length of the time copyrights were in force, and it seems to me there's a dilemma. At least as I was reading about it, that in the area of fan fiction, people kind of wish the copyright law didn't go as long. Could you talk a little bit about, is there a dilemma? On the one hand, writers would like to own their work, but on the other hand, people would like to play with their characters.
Yeah. So there's a couple different things. Fan fiction, the kind of fan fiction that I'm talking about, is non-commercial and transformative and falls under the fair use exemption. You can, as long as you're not making money off it, basically you're fine. That's the kind of the basis for the archive of our own that I helped build. There is the problem with the constant extension of copyright, which has been largely fueled by Disney in order to keep hold of Mickey Mouse, is that, Disney is trying to protect Mickey Mouse, and all this work is being lost because it's literally, if you want to make something with a Mickey Mouse on it, or to show an old Mickey Mouse movie, you know who to go to. But there's a lot of old films, a lot of old books, where the rights are just hanging in limbo. These are orphan works. The estates are gone. The writers who made them are dead. That doesn't mean the works don't have value, but it becomes an enormous burden to find the people who do own these rights, if there is anyone, and the punitive damages for doing it, for just publishing it, are so high that people are just terrified to make a mistake. So what they're doing is these works are just disintegrating. They're old movies that are literally no longer watchable because nobody could make a copy of them. So what the extension of the copyright law is doing in practice is, in order to protect a tiny, tiny fraction, like 0.01% of material that is commercially viable, still to this day, a lot of work of writers who, if they wanted anything at this point, would just want their work to continue on, to want their words to be heard, it is being lost, and the public domain is being impoverished. And the public domain is really important because that is, we're talking here this whole weekend, right, about telling stories under the influence, telling stories inspired by other work. When I say that Temeraire has this family tree, it is just that it happens to have quite a visible family tree. There is no work with two very strong parents that are quite visible. There is no work that does not have a large family tree, sometimes with dozens of parents. There is no work that actually stands in isolation, that is not talking to other work. And so when we make it harder to talk to other work by increasing the distance between you and the work that you can talk to openly, you know, what that means is that you are actually diminishing the possibilities for conversation. The first work that I can talk to now is the work that was published in 1923. That's a huge gap. That's a huge distance of time and space, and the person, and it's not that it's not possible, but it's also entirely possible that I don't have something to say anymore, whereas I might have had something to say if somebody 50 years ago had had the right to talk to that work. So that is my way of saying that I do think that is a problem with the overextension of copyright, and that I do think that there should be a better balance. Sorry.
Yeah, we wouldn't have Hagseed if Shakespeare was still under copyright, right?
Right. Well, we wouldn't have Shakespeare. We wouldn't have Shakespeare, right? I mean, literally everything in Shakespeare.
Right.
You know?
Any other questions?
Did you pick somebody?
It's fine.
I'm sorry, I can't see if it.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is perhaps a silly question,
There are no silly
but
questions.
I don't know, and I'm asking you to explain to me, what is a fan novel or a fan
fan
story
fiction?
or a fan fiction?
It's a,
I have
it's
no
a,
idea.
it's a story that's okay, I wrote fan fiction too. I loved Star Wars, the movie Star Wars, when I was 11 years old, and I saw it, the first one, in the theater. And when I got home from that movie, I started writing stories based on Star Wars, the original movie. It's just stories based on other stories, but not that you have published because you can't, because you don't own the characters. So you can't, they're copyrighted. Is that a good?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
there's
you
a-
don't,
yeah.
you don't like, I mean, the internet did not exist when I was 11 years old, so I just wrote them in my bedroom and then put them in my desk, and that was it. I didn't have the internet to share them or anything like that. So they're just really, it's like you're a fan and you write fiction based on the thing you're a
You were
fan
writing
of.
drawer
You could-
fic.
Yeah, it was drawer fic. You could actually do it about your favorite football team. I know people who write them about, like, the Miami Heat.
Really?
You do not want to read it, okay? Maybe you do, I don't know. But you know, you can write it about anything that you're a fan of. It's just fiction, literally about whatever you're a fan of. However, you cannot publish it to make money off it because it's, well, I don't know, I guess.
Well, you can, sorry, boring thing. Fair use has 4 aspects. There's a 4-factor test. And one of them is it interfering with the market? But that's not the only way.
But like, of the
So-
Miami Heat, could you write for, no? 'Cause those
Well,
are
not potentially because they are people of public record.
Yeah, I guess.
So it would actually be a different area of law.
Let's not talk about the Miami
yeah,
Heat.
sorry.
I'm sorry I brought it up.
No.
That was a bad example.
Yeah. But for instance, there is a story, there's a book called The Wind Done Gone.
That's a parody, though.
Which, I mean, it's not a parody in that it's not humorous.
I'm sorry,
It's a story, it's a retelling of Gone with the Wind.
yeah.
And it was found fair use precisely because it was sufficiently transformative. It is written from the point of view of a slave, experiencing the events from her point of view. And you can see why the court found
Right.
that had value as speech.
Yes.
That overcame the fact that it was potentially, interfering with the market for.
But Margaret
Gone with the
Mitchell's estate challenged it.
Yes.
Yeah, they
Yes.
did. I don't think that was fan fiction.
Wind. I mean, well, you can. It depends,
It was
right?
like
you can-
Anti-fan fiction.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did that help?
Thank you.
Okay. I mean,
I'll keep trying.
what's a fan what?
Oh, fanvidder, VID is people who make, the equivalent of YouTube videos, like music videos. They would take Star Wars, cut it up
This
to a
is-
song of their own,
This
and
is
make.
why I don't go on the internet anymore.
Yeah.
No, it's like, no, I'm kidding.
Yes.
You should. It's good. It's a good place. Sometimes.
This question is for Meg. I was wondering if, since the topic or theme is under the influence, and seems today that it's focused more on under the influence of the women of the story, I was wondering if you could say that you were influenced by Marion Brady's Mists of Avalon in your Avalon books.
You know what? what? I have to admit, I never read that. I know, I'm so sorry. I did not. I tried to steer away from fiction. I really, this is weird, and I know I was writing a fictional book about King Arthur. I tried to only read nonfiction because I really wanted to make my fictional book very realistic. So I did not read, and I also didn't read any of Mary Stuart's, like the Crystal Cave or anything like that. I didn't do that, and I didn't even read the what's the most famous one? The Once and Only King, I think. Is that? Once and Future King. Yeah, I know. Because, you know, wanted to do my own take, and I didn't want to be unduly influenced by anybody. And I know those are all great books. I just didn't. I try not to read other people's interpretations because, like, for instance, I'm not writing a dragon book, so it's okay for me to read Naomi's. But I try not to read other people's because I don't want to be influenced, even though we are under the influence, I know. I tried to stick to the original myths, and it's crazy. So with Persephone, the Abandoned series is the same thing. I also wrote a vampire book called Insatiable, and I did that because I'm so mad that people think vampires are romantic because they're horrible killing machines. So that was kind of like in response to the kind of craze a little while ago where everybody was kind of in love with vampires, and I tried to make mine about horror, although it got a little romantic there, I have to admit. It was unfortunate. And no spoiler, but maybe the vampire doesn't turn out so well in the end. Because I do love horror movies too, so I thought that would be fun.
I thought it was
fans
interesting.
Did not like it. That turns out the fans do not want the vampire to be bad.
Yeah.
Not all fans, but some of them. I got some mail.
You hewed a little closer to the original Dracula story
Yeah,
than,
because that's how it's
Twilight
supposed to
at
go.
all.
I
Right.
did read the original Dracula because I thought that would be okay. But let me tell you, I still get mail. People are like, when are you going to write the sequel where he comes back alive? And I'm like, not that. You totally missed the point. He does not come back alive. Oh, well. So we won't be going back to that one. Sorry. A little off topic there. I was hewing closely to canon, is how I should have put that. Oh, dear.
That's all the time we have.
Thank you.